This is Cyberpunk running at almost 1,000 frames per second on the new RTX 5090. What an absolute weapon, it's 3 times faster than my old 4090. At least, that's what Nvidia wants you to believe. The RTX 5090 is a technological marvel. I'm holding 92 billion transistors alongside 32 gigabytes of memory on the tiniest circuit board that I've ever seen on a flagship GPU. It is just truly mind-bending how far things have come. But it's also $2,000 this time around. So before we empty our wallets, let's take a closer look at what's happening. First, a little bit of context. Let's rewind a couple of years and take a look at the 3090 versus the 4090. As you can see, it was a pretty big jump in performance, 74% to be exact in these specific games. In fact, in some games, the difference is roughly double. As for the new 5090, well, the upgrade is a lot more mellow. Most of the games here sit around a 30% uplift over the 4090. Red Dead Redemption 2 saw the biggest jump of 41%. Next was the new God of War at 38%. And there are a couple here which seem to lack the full GPU utilization of the 5090. Hopefully those get patched soon. But yeah, for the most part, about a 30% uplift is what you can expect. That's a very big drop off from the gains that we saw going from the 3090 to the 4090. But realistically, it's still a decent-ish jump that will make a difference. If a 4090 is sitting around 150 FPS or so, the 5090 will now be a lot closer to 200. Normally, I wouldn't roast a GPU for only being 30% faster than last time, but here's where things don't look so great. This is the power draw of the RTX 3090 across those same 12 games. It has a TDP of 350 watts, and it mostly sits around that level. The 4090, despite having a claimed TDP of 450 watts, it actually doesn't pull that much more in most games. In some games, it's actually lower than the 3090. And remember, this is while the 4090 is 74% faster on average. But hold on to your seat, because this is the power increase for the 5090. Apart from the couple of games here that were just underutilized, we are seeing right around 500 watts of power draw on average, which is just insane. This is a colossal increase in power. I hope your room has air conditioning because you are definitely going to need it. And look, the only 30% or so performance gain over the 4090, I could honestly forgive that if the power draw was the same or maybe a little bit lower would be nice. But man, let's be real here. It's looking like there is no efficiency gains in this new architecture at all. God of War Ragnarok seemed to draw the most amount of power in the games that I tested, but even the 4090 just tips over 400 watts. The new 5090, on the other hand, it's tapping right up against that listed 575 watt TDP. It absolutely chugs power. Now, if you live in the freezing cold and your PC has at least a 1000 watt power supply, then this probably doesn't mean too much. And in that case, I do have to admit, 200 FPS at 4K with all settings cranked to max, I mean, it is truly a beast of a GPU. You won't ever be thinking twice about what settings to play at because you can literally just set everything to max quality and still get a smooth experience. But if we have to talk about the architectural improvements and power efficiency, usually the number one thing to look for in each new generation of GPU or CPU, Nvidia's Blackwell is not looking that great. For some more context, here's every Nvidia flagship GPU of the past decade, sparing the Titan GPUs. Notice that between the 980 Ti and the 2080 Ti, there's barely any power increase at all. Yet, we still see respectable performance jumps each time. This new 5090, on the other hand, it looks a lot like the jump between the 2080 Ti and the 3090. That was also roughly a 30% jump for 100 watts more power. This is almost the same thing. I know the FPS gained looks bigger on this chart just because of the way frames per second scales, but the numbers look eerily close. There's one more thing we need to discuss though, and that is multi-frame generation. It's an exclusive feature on these 50 series GPUs, and it can almost quadruple your frame rates. With multi-frame gen, you can now choose between different multipliers. 2x, just like the normal frame gen that we've already seen, but now 3x or 4x. And yeah, you can literally play path-traced Cyberpunk at 4K, 240 frames per second. I want to start by saying that my expectations for multi-frame gen were down here. They were down at the bottom of the barrel. I don't like the idea of AI generated frames at all, nor do I think really anyone actually does. But I thought I'd give it an honest try. I plugged the 5090 into a 4K 240Hz OLED, and I ran through some Cyberpunk. I played around with the different multipliers, had a look for the different visual artifacts and stuff like that, and honestly, every single time, I found myself wanting to play at 4x, simply because the frame rate jump was so substantial. I know it sounds like a complete meme playing single-player games at 240Hz, but the immersion and lifelikeness, it actually does improve so much with those extra frames. But it is not perfect, and there are motion artifacts. If you look closely at the edges, you'll see some choppiness and pixelation. The more movement there is, the worse this will look. And yeah, I can't lie, in games where you're sitting there observing and admiring the graphics, it's pretty easy to notice. You won't exactly be able to pick out and count all the little blocks, but the subtle motion trail effect that this leaves, it is very noticeable. What is way more noticeable though, is the difference between 80 FPS and 250 FPS. If we normalize for every other graphic setting in the game and you're just left with those two options, I'm honestly choosing the 250 FPS with motion artifacts every single time. I know that sounds so weird, but when you feel that smoothness difference between those two frame rates, it is night and day. Especially because the latency increase doesn't really get much worse with those higher frame gen multipliers. With frame gen completely off compared to cranked all the way up to 4x, it's only a 3 to 5 millisecond increase in latency, which is really surprising and impressive. The cool thing is though, if 200 FPS gaming is really what we want to do, we don't even need frame gen to do that. Even in Cyberpunk at 4K, we just need to drop the graphics settings a bit to get that smoother experience. The problem though is that you need to drop them quite a bit. We need to now use the medium graphics preset, and all ray tracing needs to be switched off. And as you can see, the game just does not look the same. As for the latency difference, it is pretty substantial between native rendering and multi-frame gen if you're comparing the same frame rates. And this is the main reason that I'd never recommend frame gen for any game that's even mildly competitive. I can't notice, by the way, any artifacting with mouse movement and camera movement, which was really great to see. So if you're exploring and looking around, it actually feels pretty decent. It's the fast driving and riding, at least in Cyberpunk, where those artifacts become pretty obvious. On a bike especially, it's really bad. But yeah, they're not real frames after all, but I don't know if I would call them fake frames completely either. Of course, they're generated, but most of the time they feel very convincing. I'm definitely glad it's an option instead of it not existing at all. Path traced Cyberpunk at 240Hz is not something I expected to experience anytime soon. As for this tiny new little cooler, it's actually pretty impressive. Slightly higher temps than what I saw with a 4090 Fe, but of course, we're pumping a lot more power this time around. I was seeing really low 70s with a 21 degree ambient room temperature, and that was with everything completely stock, pulling a little bit over 500 watts. I also stress tested it in Firmark for about 30 minutes, where it did pull the full 575 watts, no problem, and there the temp settled at around 76 degrees. Most of the time though, you're going to be running at around 480 to 500 watts in most games, so expect much lower than this. But yeah, it's a really impressive little cooler. So look, this thing, it's a beast. It's the fastest GPU at the moment. AMD has nothing that can compete with this thing, nothing even remotely close. And that's the reason that this thing is $2,000. But at that price, you've got to be really interested in this new multi-frame gen stuff, or the 32 gigabytes of VRAM for 3D or production apps, for it to start even making sense. Now, if you're coming from a 3090 or a 3080, then it's a much more compelling upgrade. It's like well over double the frame rates. Maybe though, just pretend that the 4090 never existed. You could have potentially upgraded to that a lot sooner, and you would have been getting most of the performance that you're getting here. Still, a few more things that I want to test out for this one, as well as just putting it in a really tiny case to see how it handles that. But at the very least, the 5070 and 5080 are yet to be seen, so definitely stay tuned for those.